Well, thank you very much, everyone, for having me here today. So as Glenn said, my name is Bethany and I'm a lecturer at the University of Tasmania here in sunny Hobart, Tasmania. So what I want to talk about today is something that is quite big picture, but something that I really think we need to have a bit more of a discussion about in the community. So I've called this the AEO conundrum, and I'm sure we've all been victim to it at one point or another. So say you're at a party and you've met a new person and you're going through your standard chit chat. Inevitably, what's going to happen is someone's going to ask you what your job is. And this always kind of freezes me for a second, and I have a little bit of a panic about trying to answer that question. And for most people, I think this is a really easy question to answer. If you're a lawyer or you're a speech pathologist, you say that, you're done. But for us that work in EO, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. How do we actually explain what we do in a way that people will actually understand us? Over the last few years, I've come up with a number of ways to try and do this. The first option is where, when I was a bit younger, I would go straight in and say exactly what I mean. I work in remote sensing. And then what happens is whoever you're talking to immediately just kind of glazes over and I start to panic. And I think, oh no, what have I done? Have I said something wrong? And I backpedal. And I try and break down my job into smaller and smaller chunks. And that leads us to door 2, where I oversimplify. And a lot of the time that's going to be fine and people will understand, but sometimes it's not. And I end up having to have an awkward conversation about why I'm being maybe a little bit condescending. The third door, the one that I go through the most often now, is where I give kind of a tangential answer and don't really answer the question. So for most people in scenario 1, that's fine if you say something like, oh, I work at the university. But then what happens is that sometimes people actually really want to know. And you have to backpedal and go through both door number 2 and door number 1. So the older I get, the more I find myself kind of heading towards door 3 by default and trying to avoid that conversation at all possible costs. And part of it is that I don't want people to feel uncomfortable when they don't necessarily understand what I do. But a lot of it is just that it's awkward and it's a bit uncomfortable to have to explain it. But the more I think about it, the more I suspect that I'm not the only person who's hiding behind this easy answer door. And I think a lot of us in the community are also guilty of kind of cowering and trying to avoid those conversations. But I think what we need to start doing is we need to start looking at why we do this and how we can kind of be a little bit more pragmatic. On the other hand, though, I know how annoying and how frustrating it is to constantly have to justify yourself and constantly explain, why what you do is valid and why it's a real job. And that can be really demoralizing and it can be very easy to fall into that trap. I think, though, that as a community, we're at a really important kind of crossroads in our development. What we're seeing is increased awareness of what we do as a field. And there's lots of stories on the ABC and through our media about how Earth observation is kind of revolutionizing a lot of science. But that makes it difficult when people still don't really know what Earth observation is. And what we're also seeing is that there are increasingly demands for people that have skills in Earth observation and people who are trained to work in these jobs that don't necessarily exist yet. But how can we put someone in a job if they don't know that job exists? And how can we give someone skills if they don't know how to get them? Another thing that we're seeing a lot of lately is that businesses are becoming increasingly aware of how important we are and the value that we can give them in terms of products and services. A lot of the time, businesses will have heard the words remote sensing or Earth observation, but it's very hard to kind of make that connection between those words and actually producing a product. So these are some very big issues. And I think for a second, what we need to do is take a step back and realize how a lot of us ended up in these jobs in the first place. So for me, I'm in this job purely by accident. I was tapped on the shoulder by a lecturer when I was at uni and told that this is something that I should give a go. So for a lot of us, the road has been quite obscured, and it's very easy for us as people who have kind of weathered this initial kind of crappy road to kind of smack down people who are coming at it from a slightly different path. So these might be people who are teaching themselves or having a go and not necessarily doing things the right way the first time around. We need to kind of overstep this gatekeeping mentality a little bit and be a bit more open to the idea, that people can come into this career from outside of the university system. They can begin to teach themselves. There are so many resources that are available to people now that we as a community really need to embrace them and start pointing people in the right direction if they have those questions about what we do. The other thing we need to remember is that when we think about what a scientist is, everybody knows what a chemist is or a geologist is, but no one really knows what someone who works in Earth observation is. And I think a really big part of that is that in school, you're taught how to become a chemist. You go to uni, you do your undergrad degree, you move on. But for us, the career path isn't quite as clear cut. And a lot of the time, people only experience us as a discipline for the first time in their undergraduate degrees, and often through 1 or 2 units that they take as an elective. We need to really be working on how we can kind of reach out to our sister disciplines and bring students in and get them through that first door. The other thing we need to be doing is focusing on how we can train graduates to be productive. So training people for academic careers isn't necessarily the thing that we should be prioritizing. We should be prioritizing training high quality analysts and teachers, because these are people that can have that conversation about what Earth observation is. So that's a lot of stuff to talk about in just 6 minutes. But I think what we need to be doing is we need to stop being so afraid of these conversations, and we need to be looking for our people that do know what we do. And I think we're looking for those unicorns or looking for those rare people that know what we do and trying to relate to them and have those conversations with people that don't necessarily already know is how we make our way through that final door and become fully accepted as our own bona fide field. And thank you very much. That is my talk.